The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from The Commanding Self by Idries Shah. Sufi Thought, Experience and Teaching. Thousands of books and monographs have been written on Sufism and the Sufis, almost all of them from the point of view of other ways of thinking. The result has been chaos in the literature and confusion in the reader. Over the centuries, some of the world's most eminent scholars have fallen into the trap of trying to examine, assess, or consider the Sufi phenomenon through a set of culture-bound preconceptions. All this may not be as foolish as it looks to us today. After all, it is only relatively recently that students, including academics and people of the spirit, have begun to realize that their attitudes have traditionally been heavily influenced by subjectivity and unexamined assumptions. Although the pendulum is slowly swinging back, there is still no lack of people, specialists and others, who continue to look at anything, including Sufis, in anything but an objective way. The main problem is that most commentators are accustomed to thinking of spiritual schools as systems, which are more or less alike, and which depend upon dogma and ritual, and especially upon repetition and the application of continual and standardized pressures upon their followers. The Sufi way, except in degenerate forms which are not to be classified as Sufic, is entirely different from this. Following closely after the primary misconception is the general impression that all spiritual entities must strongly depend upon emotion. Indeed, there is a marked confusion, even in the most lucid writers, between spirituality and emotionalism. Such confusion does not exist in authentic Sufi teaching or study. The misconceptions of which the above two are typical produce in the student a frame of mind through which he or she will try to approach the understanding or study of Sufism with predictably useless results. For this reason, Sufi literature shows a marked rejection of ultra-formalism, of mental fetishes, the oversimplifications which hamper understanding. The Sufis refer to the action of the mixture of primitive emotionality and irrelevant associations which bedevil outside would-be observers as that of the commanding self. It is only since the 1950s, with the discovery of the far-reaching effects of conditioning, brainwashing, and attitude engineering, that the subjective nature of virtually all approaches to knowledge has been perceived to the degree to which the Sufis, for centuries, have tried to establish. The Sufis have always taught, examine your assumptions, avoid mechanicality, distinguish faith from fixation. The Sufi teacher, in the first place, has to be someone who has experienced all the stages of the way along which he will conduct his disciples. Outward observers are not capable of commenting upon Sufism, only upon its externals. They lack both the experience and the capacity to discriminate between real and degenerate forms. Who tastes, knows, is a Sufi saying. Equally, whoever does not taste does not know. The validity of this concept is, naturally enough, strenuously opposed by outward observers. But if, in any field, an unqualified person lacking essential experience decides to become an expert, it is inevitable that the specialist, the person with the experience, will, indeed must, assert the primacy of proper knowledge. It has to be remembered here that the externalists, whether people of the spirit or of the pen and tongue, are themselves not particularly to blame. Reared on the concept that anyone can, at will, examine anything, they are victims of their own culture's assumptions. After all, this approach is adequate for a large number of disciplines. They have merely applied a principle which holds good in one area to a subject where it does not. The Sufi, unlike the externalist, cannot and does not work mechanically. The projection of the message and the help which is given to the learner must always vary in conformity with the needs of the time, the culture involved, and the nature and potential of the student. But as soon as we say this, we can see that Sufi organization, teaching, and learning differ fundamentally from all other systems. The Sufi, in short, is aiming for a development, not to produce conditioned reflexes. He is teaching, not training. He intervenes to provide the right stimulus at the right time for the right person. Such an activity is seen as chaotic by those who cannot perceive its purposefulness, just as the way of life in some open societies feels unbearably disorderly to those who have escaped from regimented ones, something which frequently happens today. The tendency to seek reassurance and regularity is common to all human beings. This is reflected in their cleaving to oversimplified systems. It explains why many people are drawn to organizations which offer authority and certainty. There is nothing wrong with order and discipline. Indeed, these are essentials to all human groupings. But the misuse of this proclivity in areas where it does not apply attenuates or delays progress. It results in the uncomfortable feeling, even among the most regimented, that there is something else. And yet, exposure to strong discipline does not of itself produce as a reaction a necessarily wholesome affinity for truth. It is noticeable that coercive, regimented, or rigorously intellectualist societies throw up weird cults and aberrations, providing both the supply of and the demand for certain emotions. There is a vast accumulation of Sufi teachings, much of it in writings, which would-be students plough through looking for Sufism and wondering why it seems so often self-contradictory. The simple answer is that this material is largely time and culture-based. Most of it was prescribed for specific audiences at certain times and under particular conditions. Choosing the relevant materials for any time is a specialized task. To try to make sense of all of it would be like taking a bundle of medical prescriptions issued over the years to a variety of people and working out one's own therapy from such largely irrelevant papers and without certain specialized medical knowledge. Sufi teaching is prescribed. Such parts of the Sufi classics, tales of the masters, letters and lectures and so on which apply to the individual and the group today have to be selected and applied consciously and appropriately by someone who is attuned to certain realities. This concept is especially irksome to the academic worker, who always has a bias towards utilizing every scrap of information he can find, not towards assessing contemporary applicability. He is, in fact, in a different field from the Sufi. His attitude influences even general readers. If the scholar is unwilling to accept this concept, the conventional spiritual thinker is equally hampered. He, or she, does not wish to face the fact that Sufi activity is often carried out in a way which does not, for the conventionalist, resemble spiritual matters at all. The fact that the Sufi has to script and project his teaching in a manner which will work, not in a manner which will remind others of spirituality, arouses, if ever perceived, feelings of great discomfort in the conditioned devout man or woman. Yet the Sufi insists that the adherence to traditional forms is not a spiritual activity at all. It is only in recent years that he has been able to call upon the insights and experiments of the sociologists and psychologists to establish, in current terminology, and hence in acceptable form, the fact that very many people of the spirit are only religious in the sense that they have been conditioned to feel certain emotional responses, and that such people are, anthropologically speaking, little else than members of a tribe. These facts, written down and asserted centuries ago by Sufis, are now thought by modern thinkers to be a great new discovery. The supposedly devout are, in Sufic terms, as well as in the new understanding of contemporary workers in the social sciences, cultists, but hardly people of the spirit in the Sufic sense. The use of authority figures, canonical literature, liturgy, exercises, special clothes, and similarly standardized elements are now plainly seen as ingredients in training systems which differ, one from the other, only in the ideas and symbols used. Yet these factors linger and confuse, producing blinkered minds. The deluded Sufis down the centuries are those who have taken temporary teaching situations, parables and the like, and stretched them to apply as perennial truths, exercises and the like. This kind of development, or hypertrophy, has taken place in other projections than that known as Sufic. Indeed, it is this which is responsible for the existence of a large number of cults and religious bodies which are generally believed to be authentic and authoritative. In reality, the fossilization which is represented by such groups is the antithesis of a spiritual school. Instead of developing people, it imprisons them, as genuine Sufis have never tired of pointing out. So far has this process gone that, in most cultures, the imitation has all but driven out the original. The result is that, examining certain existing religious cults, some of them involving multiple millions of people and possessing great influence, nobody could be blamed for believing this degeneration to be religion itself. Recently, explaining this attitude to a famous spiritual leader, I received the answer, "But it must be true, otherwise so many people would not believe it." He had clearly not heard of Gresham's law, bad money drives out good. I said, "There are twice as many adherents of such and such a religion as there are of your own. By your logic, that one must be true. Its success proves it. Why don't you join that one instead of your own?" It was at that point that he started to shout at me. Among the Sufis, the development of orders, turuk, gives us a conspicuous example of the process which I have been describing. Of all the major paths among the supposed Sufis of today, not a single one is traceable in its foundation to the man who is named as its founder. Each came into being only after his death, formulated from some of his specific teachings employed for local purposes, and soon turned into a cult. Orders are temporary and time-limited. None was started by its putative founder. When the teacher died, his disciples, heroically but misguidedly, tried to preserve his teachings. The results we know. Follow them and you will produce, perhaps, an excellent replica of a 13th century man, and that is all. All the distortions, and more, which have persisted in Sufic and other teaching, are due to the presence and activity of the commanding self. There is no intention of destroying or undermining the commanding self, but the Sufi activity insists upon asking, does it command you, or do you command it? Cultural and psychological problems of the commanding self. The Western cultural milieu, more than those of the East, provides a background mentality which encourages the commanding self. Procedures designed for Eastern people are likely to have negative effects if adopted by Westerners. Briefly, The Eastern tradition that one learns until one is permitted by a teacher to teach, an ancient tradition perpetuated in apprenticeship and the granting of degrees in the West, is not adhered to in many non-academic areas of the West. The reason for this is not far to seek. In the West, the prevailing culture's emphasis is on haste, on getting something and passing it on, for example, products or ideas, after value enhancing, and so on. This has taken the form, in spiritual, psychological, and other areas, of people trying to teach, to expound, to treat or cure, to communicate before they are properly fitted to do so. The fact that, in the West, anyone can set up as an expert, a teacher, a therapist, or an advisor compounds this error. The commanding self, always agile in its sophistication, conceals from the individual that he or she is trying to run before being able to walk. When people start to approve of what the individual is doing, this is misread as a validation of his or her role. In fact, it is usually only the fact that some people are dependent characters by nature or formulation. This, indeed, is the ideology of many cults and most examples of people who have become prominent beyond their true current capacity. Someone has to pay for this. Sometimes many people pay for it. The reason is that the situation, as just outlined, is inherently unstable. Stresses within the individual cause distress, even breakdown. The stresses are the result of the battle between vanity, however well concealed, and the inner knowledge that the personality is false, is trying to run before being able to walk. This condition is hard to treat. The commanding self will struggle hard to maintain itself, convincing the sufferer that the symptoms are essential parts of the personality. The sufferer will constantly imagine an inability to return to the baseline, become more modest, humble, less self-assertive, because he or she feels that this would mean a depletion of the personality. The commanding self, though, can be seen as a sort of parasite, which first complements the personality, then takes over certain parts of it, and masquerades as the personality itself. Breakdowns of communication are a frequent result. Sufi teachers, when describing this syndrome, are often accused of trying to keep the individual down, of saying, "You are not ready yet," in order to maintain authority. This criticism is invalid unless there is plenty of evidence to support it, and if there is, the supposed teacher is not a Sufi at all. The answer? Time and service rather than wanting to take a place on the totem pole. It is for this reason that Sufi teachers divert vanity from the spiritual area by encouraging their disciples to channel the commanding self's activities to any worthy worldly ambition, while continuing to study the Sufi way in a modest and non-self-promoting manner. Introduction. The Pit. A young woman who had been sheltered from many experiences of life found herself one day in the glittering foyer of a London theatre. She had not been to a theatre before, and she was almost totally unprepared for what she saw. Her indoctrination at home had been of an emotional religiosity which dwelt upon the delights of heaven and the horrors of the pit of hell. The lavish decoration of the entrance hall, where she had to wait for her escort to collect the tickets, was a completely new environment for her. The people were not only all strangers to her, but were dressed in a bewildering variety of colours and were characterized by a liveliness and sophistication which she could relate to nothing in her own life. Suddenly, in the midst of the bemusement engendered by these impacts, she saw and read a sign which pointed towards the orchestra stalls. It indicated the pit. What else could she do but give a scream of horror, run from the theatre and, as soon as she could, seek solace and forgiveness in earnest prayer, and that is what she did. Is this a fable? It is printed in the London Observer as news and a record of a theatrical incident contributed by a correspondent. Accounts of this nature, assuming them to be true, indicate both conditioned behavior and the persistence of what we can easily recognize as a primitive pattern of reactions in the present day. The grafting of emotion-based ideas on top of the primitive, without maturing the latter, produces the commanding self, which affects much of everyone's daily thinking. There is no difference between the responses elicited by the experience of this girl and that of a savage who has been exposed to his own local training, or indeed any civilized man or woman. If the story is not true, the fact that it can be offered as possibly true shows that such primitive patterns can repeat themselves in contemporary society. The fact that people are expected to laugh at the story is extremely interesting. The unspoken intention behind the offering of the tale as humorous, which of course it is to draw a distinction, perhaps of relief, between us and her. And, singling out this kind of easily illustrated primitive behavior, and imagining that because we can see its absurd side we ourselves do not act in a similar manner, is itself absurd. The woman had been conditioned to respond with horror and an emotional storm to certain stimuli. Today, in the most barbaric and the most advanced societies, there are millions of people, many of them certainly in positions of authority and importance, who will react in a similar manner, providing that their horror trigger is tripped. The fit study of the anthropologist surely is his own society, although he may have learnt his lessons by observing and studying other societies where, to him, patterns are more obvious. It will certainly be seen in future as one of the anomalies of this society if this is not done. Certainly it is not done to any extent yet. We still say, fancy that, the Chinese discovered gunpowder and the magnetic compass and did not develop the use of these instruments. Our successors, whoever they are, will perhaps be able to say of us, fancy, they had these tools of investigation and illustration, but they used them only on people who were other than themselves. Purpose of study and research. The purpose of a Sufi book, or any Sufi activity, is to further Sufi development. You may think that this is obvious, but it certainly is not so to the hundreds of people who inquire, every year, for information and elucidation which shows that they are trying to operate in a direction which has no relationship with Sufi aims. Let us take a simple example. We may publish a tale, probably in conjunction with one or more other stories, and perhaps in a context which makes this a teaching package. No sooner is this material released than numerous individuals try to decode it or to follow up all sorts of associations. Naturally, such attempted activity nullifies the effect of the package. In some cases, perhaps in all of them, this tendency is motivated by a learnt pattern. The pattern may be scholasticism, or it may be puzzle solving, or a tendency to seek emotional satisfactions or associations. The problem is, of course, complicated by the fact that people seem unaware that the material, as presented and used, is purposeful and all of a piece. They badly need to note the story of the small boy who dismembered a fly. He ended up with a pile of wings, legs, and so on, and then wondered where the fly itself had gone. A further complication is the normal human desire to investigate, to assess, to make use of data, and so on. This is fine, providing that you have the necessary expertise. In our field, to paraphrase a saying, those who can't try, those who can don't have to. Fortunately, it is quite easy to illustrate the dilemma for those who really want to understand it. If you are offered, for instance, strawberry jam, you have various options. You can taste it, you can try to investigate it, or you can follow up the etymology of its names and contents. The Sufis are, as they traditionally put it, engaged in tasting, not in research or testing. In any case, Sufism is not learnt by research or reinventing the wheel. Proof positive that many people who claim to be interested in Sufism are not interested in what it can offer is contained in the simple fact that, no matter how often you explain the foregoing facts, and regardless of how often they have been stated by the Sufis of the past, the requests for irrelevant information continue to pour in. And of course, the piles of flies' legs grow larger. The explanation is, luckily, quite simple. First, recall that people will tend to persist in doing something after being told that it is absurd or unnecessary because continuing with this course pleases them more than adopting a correct one. Now apply this to the situation where someone is told that his or her insistence upon a certain course is absurd. There are, of course, innocent or naive reasons. In the case of academic workers, as we see from their often useless books, the training is such that the person is unable to operate in any other way. But this only means that little, if any, real communication is possible with people who have been narrowly conditioned in this or any similar way. Conventional scholars have denounced the Sufis for centuries for deriding academic work. This is only a manifestation of the give a dog a bad name and hang it mentality, though. Sufis are, and have been, considerable scholars. But they know the difference between Sufi experience and scholasticism, and that the two are quite distinct. It is, of course, not only Sufis who are at the receiving end of this kind of approach. Even if you are an engineer, you may well be approached by people who want to use engineering metaphors in dance choreography or advertising or something. And there is no harm in that. It is when, as it were, people imagine that engineering really is ballet that problems arise. The tendency of seeking a panacea is also an aspect of this question. Not only Sufis, but all kinds of specialists are regularly approached by people who want instant cures, improvements in their social, psychological, or economic life, or, perhaps most frequently, some emotional stimulus. Of course, in the last named kind of case, an internal, mental censor usually ensures that the request is put in what the applicant imagines to be an acceptable form. And although such behavior is often regarded as hypocritical or self-deceived, it is much more likely to be socially conditioned. Sometimes it is almost bizarre where the conditioning has slipped. A few days ago I got a letter from a well-known but indigent person who asked for advice on how to make a lot of money in a very short time. Why? Not for myself, he says, but because I could do so much good with it. What it all boils down to is that, regrettably, people have to know more about themselves before they undertake what are so often misconceived projects. Naturally, the more they are in need of such advice, the less likely they are to take it. That has always been the case. But there are still Sufis who can carry out their work in spite of what might seem a considerable problem. Not long ago I was saying something like this to a man who immediately insisted, "But I have to know myself, which is the goal of all right-thinking people." When I asked him what he meant by "know thyself," it turned out that he thought that it meant that he could make a breakthrough into a higher state of consciousness from where he was at the moment. He honestly had no idea that you have to get the lower state of consciousness into good order first. Trying to run, in this sense, before he could walk, did not seem absurd to him. On the contrary, he next assailed me with, If it were true that one has to attend to smaller things before attempting greater ones, why is this not taught more extensively? There is a long history of wise men saying simply, "Know thyself." They have not hedged it around with the qualifications which you are trying to impose. I give him due credit for speaking his mind, but, as I said to him, he had made no examination of his sources or assumptions, even within the field in which he was competent. Because first, by tradition, simple statements are only headlines. Second, many headlines have been endlessly repeated by people who may have become reputed as authorities, but many of whom were only repeating slogans, however sincerely. It is the goldsmith who can assay the gold, as Rumi said. But we constantly meet people who have read Rumi and taken no notice of this important and much repeated statement of his. What do they take from Rumi instead? The dervish dance is one thing, and what is wrong with that? Only the fact that Rumi himself is on record as saying that he applied it specifically for the 13th century people of Asia Minor because of certain characteristics of theirs, which are not to be found quite to the same extent among the thousands of people who have adopted dervish dancing recently in the West. It is not only in the East that we have people busily turning themselves into imitations of medieval Orientals. But if they were to stop and look at what they were doing, it would spoil the fun. Are you surprised that Sufis have so often said down the centuries that a large number of those who profess to want to follow the Sufi way do not really want it at all? The fact is that people have their individual and common priorities. They will seek fulfillment of these, and through the channel and in the manner which appears to be appropriate. But those which appertain to the Sufi way or any other specialization will often be quite different from these. Sufis are not here to satisfy a demand. They exist to share what they have got. These two things are not always the same. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation and is copyright 2019. All rights reserved.